Okay, as this week winds down, and hopefully you're already working on your resume level for this week because the resume is due at the end of the week. Resume 4. As this happens, we need to look a little bit more at some design ideas. Unfortunately, having to focus so much on HTML and CSS and making it all work, um, only now do we get to think a little bit about the design and what you want things to look like. And of course, you could spend an entire class on just that, but we have to move ahead. So here we go. You saw the title page was crap design. Not a joke, really, just a memory trick. Contrast, repetition, alignment, proximity. You may have heard of these design concepts, perhaps even presented as crap design before. That idea is used in the design of many things. Crap design first began as on print design concepts. However, now it's used on the web and every kind of design you can imagine. These four design concepts, contrast, repetition, alignment, proximity, translate well into web design. And if you can keep these in mind, your design decisions, if you can inform your design decisions with these concepts, you'll see a great improvement in your web design. Contrast. The idea behind contrast is that making different things really different. It could be different in size. We definitely want our H1 to be the biggest, and definitely bigger than the H2, which definitely has to be bigger than the H3, and so on. It could be shape. We like to have different shape images, for instance, on a page. You might have different shape blocks and layout. Very horizontal, a very vertical. Color, of course, we have contrast in color. We must have contrast in color between the reading copy and the background for legibility. One of the biggest mistakes you can make is have a middle-of-the-road background color, like something that's just kind of in between light and dark, and have text that is also kind of in between light and dark, or perhaps what you've chosen for your link colors for static or hover or visited, that those have lack of contrast with each other, with the background. Contrast has to apply here for sure. And in color, the biggest issue, as I said, is reading text like paragraphs, list items, and the background. Make sure there's a big contrast there in color. So contrast sets up hierarchy and gives us variety. Lets us know what's more important, what's less important, and gives us some visual variety. Repetition. We have repetition throughout our websites, and it isn't necessarily a bad thing. It brings consistency. We look to look for the same things used the same ways. So if I use a certain color on a H2, chances are I'm going to use that same color on my H2s throughout. If I make an exception, it should be a really good reason. It should be distinctive. So we like to see repetition. We do repetition in spacing. The spacing under your H1 on every page is probably going to be very similar. Your spacing around photographs, for when we float photos into text, is going to be the same probably on every page, on every photo. The fonts. You may use a single font repeated throughout the entire site with no changes at all, and that will be fine. If you do change it on a certain heading, it's going to probably be different on that heading, that same level heading throughout. So there's consistency and repetition. Colors too, and so on. So think about repetition. Alignment. This means the elements should line up, or they shouldn't even come close. But the problem is when elements are nearly aligned, they look odd. So it's fine to have lots of things aligned and then have something definitely off the alignment and separate. Because it's separate, it's different. You want it to be different. That's great. But watch out for things that just kind of line up but don't quite. This also applies to text alignment. Chances are you should stick to the same text alignment, which is going to be left aligned like this over here, as opposed to centered. or right align would be on the right margin throughout. Now you might have a particular heading, for instance, centered, and that's fine, but you're not going to do very much centering. Proximity. Proximity has to do with spacing. The things that go together should be closer together than the things that they don't go with. So then H2 and the paragraphs and lists that follow it should feel like a chunk. Now that doesn't mean they're really tight together. We like white space, but we would probably add space on top and bottom of them, of the H2 and then of the last paragraph or list in that group, because we want the things that they don't go with to be separate. So assuming that this paragraph is separate, having space between is fine, but these things should go together. They should probably be a little closer than that. And don't be afraid of white space. White space isn't white necessarily, right? White space just means space where there is no text or photographs, and it could be any background color at all. We could just think of it as negative space. White space lets your eye rest, makes the rest of the page jump out more at you too. I mean, having space around something adds impact to the things that aren't space. So white space is something you should strive for. But the spacing needs to make sense. Are the things that are close together for a reason? Are the things that are further apart for a reason? So let's look at a couple of sites and think about how we could apply these things. First, let's look at, and those links you can use on your own there, of course, in the presentation. This presentation, of course, is on Moodle, like all the others in PDF format also. This is a site for the Tea Factory. And we can see all of these criteria here, right? Contrast in size, teas is really big here. Contrast in size between white, this is probably an H2, an H3, and a paragraph, right? Between the H2 and the H3, between this H2 and this H1, right? Between the H3 and the paragraph, contrast in size, contrast in color. White, green, yellow for oolong. This distinctive color, which should make this other part of this heading stand out. This little bit of green up here makes you want to grab it, this contrasting color. Contrast in shapes, this is a very horizontal shape block here, extremely horizontal, which is common for navigation, right? When we hover over the navigation, we get a very different shape. All our T's, they're all color-coded too. And there's some more down here, of course, right? We get color contrast here, contrast with the footer also. This, by the way, if you're wondering, I'm going to talk about these later. These are breadcrumbs. There's sort of like a repeated navigation with more detail at the bottom. It's good for SEO, and it's very usable too, in contact information and information on your Facebook connections and other social media. Hey, you know what? This reminds me. I'm going to be moving on soon to your Resume 4 instructions. It isn't too, when you think about contact information, you should also think about adding in social media contact information on every page, which I'm sure you have. So think about doing that too. Okay, so contrast is color, but then what's for the repetition? The white stuff is always white. Well, in this case, gray. You know what I mean. The green stuff is always green. The yellow stuff all goes together. So we have this repetition of color, repetition of sizes for headings, repetition of these blocks. These blocks are repeated. Repetition of spacing, the spacing here. And I like this. Let's move across to alignment. See how nicely aligned these things are. But this definitely isn't aligned on purpose, right? And then let's think about proximity. See how this whole chunk hangs together as a piece. It's not super tight together, but it's definitely separate from here, and separate from here, and separate from here too, right? How these chunks hang together. I'm not going to go on with these other sites. You'll see this one is definitely has the criteria we're talking about, and I'll let you look at some more sites on your own and think about those design principles. Let's continue here. Where are we? Look at these sites if you wish, and others. 960GS. 960GS, unfortunately, this is one of the things that we don't have time to actually do in this class, in this 5-week version of this class. but I strongly encourage you to read the 960GS site and give it a try. It's actually pretty easy to get the hang of. I may give you some instructions, maybe for extra credit work. We'll see about doing a 960 project. If nothing else, go to the 960 site and perhaps watch these videos. 960 is a what we call a grid system, a framework system. It's a way to use CSS to move blocks of things around with a shorthand. But the key idea is that it's all free, by the way. 960. What does 960 mean? 960 pixels wide. So in other words, it works on sites that are 960 pixels wide, which is a common size. It's nice because it's easily divisible into different chunks. The idea is that let's go ahead and look at these sites here. Is that many sites are laid out on a grid. If you're starting a site from scratch, you'd start with a grid. So for instance, let's put the grid, the 12-column grid on this site. 12 columns is a very common grid to use, and we see how this is 1, 2, 3, a 4-column chunk, a 4-column chunk, a 4-column chunk. We can see how all these little icons are laid out on a grid. So laying sites out on grid, here's a grid, a 12-column grid on this site. You can see how this is a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5-column area. This is another 1, 2, 3, 4, 5-column area. We have all this navigation is laid out on a grid. These chunks are laid out on grids. Our sites, when we start a site from scratch, as opposed to your resume site, which is just kind of organically being evolving as you've been learning, we'd almost certainly start with a grid. We'd actually start with grid paper or a similar thing for Photoshop or InDesign, and move blocks around to set up the structure ahead of time. And we would use a 960 grid system to quickly prototype with HTML and CSS our site. And we create this grids knowing how many pixels wide things are going to be, and we can just assign numbers to them, have them move around on the grid, and depending on which grid we have, this is the 12-column grid, which is one most people start with, less complicated than the bigger grids, and we would know how big things are going to be. So the grid system is a way we often begin our designs for real, as opposed to just kind of having them evolve as yours has. And please consider looking through those presentations. Before you start, we would almost certainly do a grid layout. And I have grid layout papers that you can use to actually sketch out grids and then turn them into HTML and CSS very easily using a 960 system, a prototyping system. And more about wireframing. We call this wireframing. We can do it in a computer system like Photoshop or InDesign, or we can do it just on paper. Many web designers still work on paper and then go to HTML and CSS. And that's something else to think about is to think about web design trends, which constantly change. These are some websites that keep track of trends, or just Google web design trends, web design trends 2015. I'm not going to spend the time to go through these sites, all these sites, but I just want to say that, for instance, this one talks about web design trends to look out for this year, responsive websites, ghost buttons, bigger emphasis on typography. It seems like every year we say this, but typography is always extremely important. By the way, you see the giant photo underneath? Giant photo sites are also a trend too, there's large, beautiful images that take up sites. Scrolling is a big trend these days, especially as more and more goes mobile. Fewer multi-page sites, more extremely long sites that scroll and scroll and scroll. And that one scrolls and scrolls. Card designs. These are these little chunky sites with all these little chunks of stuff. Card designs. It's sort of like calling cards. Like business cards is what the idea is. They're different shapes and sizes, but that's definitely a big trend. And these trends continue and change as we go along. So pay attention to web design trends. And let's just take a quick minute to look at the idea of thinking about a header and what is it used for. The header area, the overall structure, this big content area is usually a focus area, a body area, and then a footer area of your site. The feature area is this area here of the site usually. I'm going to pause there and go on to a part 2 very briefly to finish this stuff up.